what is going on. We are going to be looking at globalization and trade, and this is part of our macroeconomic topics. So to start with, we need to understand two key areas of trade or theories of trade. One is absolute advantage and the other is a comparative advantage. So an absolute advantage is when one country can make a product a lot cheaper than another country. So, for example, Saudi Arabia can extract crude oil much cheaper than the US. And the US can produce fruit, food, vegetables cheaper than Saudi Arabia. So they both have an absolute advantage. So hence, it makes sense for them to trade. So Saudi Arabia will buy a lot of fruit from the US, and the US will buy a lot of crude oil from Saudi Arabia. We can look at this using also a Ppf curve. So I've drawn a slightly small diagram here. So we have our Ppf for the US and our Ppf for Saudi Arabia. So on one axis, the y-axis, we have fruit. On the x-axis, we have oil. So you can see here, the one for Saudi Arabia, they can either make 2 units of fruit maximum, or they can make 8 units of oil maximum. Whereas the US can make a maximum of 8 units of fruit or 2 units of oil. So you can see that automatically the absolute advantage here for the US is fruit, and the absolute advantage here for Saudi Arabia is oil. Now, what that means is that the US they can either for them, when they make 4 units of fruit, they can make 1 unit of oil. So hence, it's a better use of their time if they just focus on making fruit. Whereas Saudi Arabia, they can either make 1 unit of fruit or 4 units of oil. Now, within that same time, it's better for them to be making 4 units of oil rather than just 1 unit of fruit. So their absolute advantage here is oil. Now, in doing so, if Saudi Arabia, you can see their Ppf here, either a maximum of 2 fruit or 8 oil, and the US here maximum 8 fruit, 2 oil, if they trade among each other, and Saudi Arabia just focuses on oil and the US just focuses on fruit, then that means that Saudi Arabia can trade their oil for fruit. Because let's see, Saudi Arabia, 8 oil, and in the US, 1 oil equals 4 fruit. So they can sell all their oil and gain all that fruit, which by themselves they wouldn't be able to, because the maximum they were able to is just only 2 units of fruit. So by trading, each with their absolute advantage, fruit for the US and oil for Saudi Arabia, then they both suddenly have a new Ppf. Their production possibility frontier has expanded for both. So now the US can have a maximum of 8 units of oil by selling them fruit. They can get all that oil. And Saudi Arabia can now have a maximum of 8 units of fruit as well by selling them oil and getting fruit in return. So that is one of the benefits of trade, when a country will have an absolute advantage. So hence that's what they're gonna trade in comparison. And it makes sense, right? Now, there is another theory, and this one is by David Ricardo, and it's called Comparative Advantage. And this became very popular in the 1800s. This was to do with trade between the US and Europe and the UK. So economists from Europe, mainly from the UK, thought it was a really bad idea to trade with the US. The reason being was because they had no absolute advantage whatsoever, because it was a lot it was more expensive to grow food in the UK and to make clothes in the UK. And it was a lot cheaper to make them in the US. So if they start trading with the US, they're worse off because there's nothing they can offer them. All they're going to do is buy all those cheap products, and if anything, what they're going to end up with is unemployment in Europe. So they decided for quotas and tariffs to protect their economy in Europe, mainly in the UK. So this is when David Ricardo, he comes into place and he goes, well, actually, there's an option where we can both benefit. Well, both countries can benefit, the UK and the US, even though the US has an advantage for both, for clothes and for food. And the economists didn't quite understand at the time, so he explained it. And this is the theory of comparative advantage. So hopefully you can see it on this diagram here. Again, this is another PPF, production possibility frontier. It shows us our maximum capacity. So this line here, the bigger one, of 16 units of food and 8 units of clothing, is for the US. So the US can either make 16 units of food if they use all their land, labor, capital, and enterprise, or factors of production, or they can use them all and make 8 units of clothing, or a combination of any of both, but they cannot go beyond it. That's if they don't trade. And the UK can either make 2 units of food or 4 units of clothing, or of a combination of any of in between, but they cannot go beyond it unless they trade, of course. But how can they benefit if they trade? Well, this is to do with comparative advantage. So when we look at this, to find the comparative advantage, we need to figure out for every country how much does it cost them to make the product. So we can see that in the UK, they can make 2 units of clothing or 1 unit of food in one particular period of time. How do I know that? Well, by looking at this, I can see they can either make 2 food or 4 clothing. So I factorize. So that's half is 1, half is 2. So 1 unit of food will equal 2 units of clothing. So their time is better spent making clothing because they can make 2 of them. If they make food with the same amount of time, they're only going to make 1 unit of food. So their advantage is that they can make clothing. In the same amount of time, they can make more clothing than food. That is their comparative advantage. And a way to see it in the graphic is literally which one is the biggest. So you can see 2 here for food and 4 for clothing. The biggest here is clothing. So that will be their comparative advantage. And then to figure out per unit, we just factorize. So half is 2, half is 1. So you can see 1 food will equal 2 clothing. And their advantage with the time they have, again, is to make 2 units of clothing rather than make only 1 unit of food. What about the US? So in the US, again, they can either make 16 food or 8 units of clothing. Now, what is the opportunity cost? The opportunity cost for them is 1 clothing equals 2 units of food. Again, how do I figure that out? I see that 16 food or 8 clothing. So therefore, in a particular amount of time, we can factorize. So I can 8th will be 2, 8th will be 1. So 1 unit of clothing equals 2 units of food. So in the same amount of time, they can either make 2 units of food or 1 unit of clothing. So it's better for them to make food rather than make just 1 unit of clothing. They can make 2 units of food. So their comparative advantage is 2 units of food because within the same amount of time as the UK, they can make 2 units of food instead of making 1 unit of clothing. So here we have the US has an advantage, a comparative advantage with food, and the UK has a comparative advantage with clothing. So hence, if the UK just focuses on clothing and they make 4 units of clothing, they can then sell that clothing to the US. And the US, what can they buy with their 4 units of clothing? With their 4 units of clothing, every unit of clothing in the US is worth 2 food. So 4 units of clothing will equal 8 units of food for the UK. So UK takes these 4 units of food to the US, trades, and comes back with 8 units of food. So with trade, here we have the new Ppf, and you can see it's expanded. So rather than being a maximum of 2 units of food, now they can get 8 units of food by selling all their clothing to the US. So they're better off. You can see their Ppf has suddenly shifted outwards. So they can produce a lot more with their factors of production by trading either 4 units of clothing, or by trading that to the US, they can get 8 units of food. Fantastic. So that's really good for the UK. So it's an incentive for the UK to focus on clothing and export it and buy food so they can expand their Ppf. So what about the US? So the US has a comparative advantage in making food. In the same period of time, they can make 2 food rather than just 1 clothing. So if they focus on just making food, they can trade that food. So if they trade that food, the food is equal, 1 food is equal 2 clothing. So if they take, let's say, if they take their 16 units of food to the UK, they will be able to get, for every unit of food, 2 clothes. So for their 16 units of food, they're going to be able to get 32 units of clothing, because they can get twice the amount in the UK. You can see 1 food equals 2 clothing. So 16 food in the US will equal 32 food in the UK. That's what they can get. So now the Ppf of the US has also shifted outwards. They can either produce 16 units of food, or they can take that to Europe and trade it and get 32 units of clothing. So instead of just having 16 food and 8 clothing, now their Ppf has shifted outwards and it's 16 food and 32 units of clothing. So that is the main basis for trade, which is still valid nowadays globally, and this is the reason why we trade in some instances, because we have an absolute advantage, or it could just be between countries like Germany and Nigeria, where even though Germany it's cheaper for them to make cars and clothes, they still are better off trading with Nigeria because of this comparative advantage, which benefits both. So it's a story of cooperation and sharing for mutual benefit. And so hence, with this showing how the Ppfs can shift outwards, trade started and tariffs were brought down, and since then globally tariffs have gone down, and we've become more globalized because both countries benefit from trading, from exporting, from sharing the resources. And that is the story of comparative and absolute advantage. Yes, good luck. Make sure you answer the questions below. I'll see you next time.